There's a set of three big categories that I like to touch on. And I will have the conversation with customers based on where their head is at, right? So,
Yeah.
category one is cost saving. We already know that log processing, that data movement, data storage is extremely costly. It's one of the fastest growing
Definitely.
cost centers for folks.
Hey guys, and welcome to the Grow IT podcast. One of your hosts here, Trey King. And today we are very excited to have our guest David from Expanso. And we'll be diving into his story a little bit, and then as well as what his company does, and then some engaging insights into the technology industry. So make sure to stick around for this one. But without further ado, David, welcome.
Thank you so much.
David, if you don't mind, just to quickly introduce yourself and just tell us a quick snippet of your story, if you don't mind.
For sure. So I'm David Aronchick. I am former lead for Google for Kubernetes. I have been working in engineering and product for a long time at Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, all of the above.
Oh, wow.
Um, my experience is I've done both small companies and startups, excuse me, and obviously some of the largest companies. And right now we're working on a distributed compute platform called Expanso, which is designed to make it easy to exercise your compute jobs where your data is rather than always at a centralized data center.
Excellent. Tell me, David, how did you get into the specific business sector? What was it that like sparked your initial interest that that made you so passionate about it?
I mean, I've always been a nerd. It very naturally came to me to like dive into these areas. I'm not a classically trained engineer or anything like that. My undergrad was in like psychology, and I wanted to be a doctor. That said, I
You went a
I
different
very quick
direction.
yeah, very different direction. So I very quickly saw this. I took classes at GW while I was working at the NIH and in software engineering, and it felt very very natural to me. I didn't, I guess I had always thought about going into enterprise software instead of a consumer. It just feels very natural to me. It feels like at scale, interesting problems, and so on. And then, in all of my companies, I've worked in the all the big companies, I've worked in these big software projects,
Yeah.
um, rather than in consumer. And so, where I was just that. Now, what I saw was at when I was at Google doing Kubernetes, and then at Microsoft leading OpenML strategy. Um, you just kept seeing the fact that there were huge amounts of data centers and things out there, data out there that was not being centralized. And these people would try and get into these really weird topologies and frameworks and things like that that
Yeah.
would, help them solve the problem. And so what we decided was to build a platform that ultimately would help them do that.
Okay, understood. Tell me, based on your expertise and experience, what are the current market trends that you are aware of, lately in your industry? What way is the wind blowing these days?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting question. Obviously, I'm highly biased in that the reality is that data is growing and growing everywhere. Again, these aren't really controversial, but it's funny because our tooling and our platforms just haven't kept up around this, and
Yeah.
so many people will approach this and say, well, okay, I'm excited to go and use your data platform, or I'm excited to do this,
Mm.
except I have things on multiple clouds. I have things on prem. I have things in retail. I have things in manufacturing. I have things, on planes, trains, and automobiles. I mean, like you just
Yeah.
have things everywhere. And yet, when we ask people in IT what to do about it, they're like, well, just, throw up a new zone on whatever US West. And it's just like, that's not how the world works. Even if you could get the world to work that way, it's not going to cut it
Yeah.
because the speed of light is constant. So what I see more than anything is a desire, a very strong desire to
Mhm.
adapt to the way the world is laid out,
Yeah.
and I see a lot of contortions on how to do that without, ripping and replacing and so on and so forth. And that's very much why we built the company.
Excellent. Tell me if you don't mind, can you maybe provide us just with a little bit of history on, Kubernetes and how it evolved, and then maybe if you don't mind, just to explain or elaborate a bit more on how Kubeflow like emerged as a solution,
Mm.
from machine learning on top of it, right?
Yeah, for sure. So, Kubernetes was very straightforward. Like Google had a way of running their applications internally, and through the wisdom, so a lot of Google engineers actually did some of the early contributions to the Linux kernel. And again, to be clear, there were isolation technologies long before that, jail and zones and so on and so forth,
Yeah.
on other platforms. But Google had made a choice on Linux, and they were some of the first groups to work on things like C groups and other things like that. Um, and then, then you really have to give enormous credit to Docker, right? They built this. C groups and namespaces and so on and so forth were valuable, but they were still very, very hard to use.
Okay.
And so Docker came along and gave you a clean API for interacting with these things. Now, that's great on a per node basis, for lack of a better term. But the
Yeah.
moment you wanted to do many of them, then you had to come along. And so that's where Google came along and rallied the industry behind Kubernetes. They made it open source and helped create the Cloud Native Compute Foundation. And again, I don't want to take anything away from IBM and Red Hat and lots of other folks who helped with that as well.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like there was definitely a need for that. So Kubernetes begins to take flight. And I had been working on it. So, the Cloud Native Compute Foundation was having, 8,000, 10,000 people keynotes and things like that. So, okay, you're like, wow, okay, there's something happening here. Um, and then I became really, I'd always been a big data guy, and I'd become really quite enamored of how we might use big data to solve all these problems out there in the world, environment, inequality, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, I would go into these customers and I would say, "Hey, customers, what's your biggest problem?" And they would be like, I don't know how to use this coming AI and ML." And I'm like, "Okay, but you already have Kubernetes. Why can't you just use that?" And they're like, "Well, we don't know how." And so that's where I leaned in. I was like, what if we just had an opinionated way to build ML pipelines on top of Kubernetes? And I get that
Yeah.
there are going to be other solutions, but we're going to start there. And to some degree that was enough. And so, I found some core contributors to some of the frameworks on Kubernetes.
Yeah.
I helped pull them together and started to work on it, and we ended up, launching Kubeflow again, purely as a way to roll out and deploy ML on Kubernetes, because we just made the assessment that, look, Kubernetes has solved all these hard problems. Let's not try and resolve those. Let's solve other hard problems. And so
Yeah.
that, again, if you wanted to do it just on raw VMs, or you wanted to do it on another orchestration platform or whatever, or no orchestration platform, great, off you go. But we're going to do this just for this very large and growing platform, Kubernetes. And so, that's kind of how we got that going. And after that, it just continued to grow, and more and more people adopted it. More, it's now in the CNCF and so on. It was pretty straightforward.
My word. Thank you for explaining it in like in labor terms that people like me can understand. It's
No,
thank you.
no, don't be silly.
That was very interesting. Thanks. Tell me a bit more, from a business point of view, what do you see as the most significant value your business can bring to obviously to other businesses and the markets? And how do you currently like communicate this specific value to your clients?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and interestingly, I mean, just earlier this morning, I was trying to explain this to some folks. There's kind of a, like I said, there's a set of three big categories that I like to touch on, and I will have the conversation with customers based on where their head is at, right? So
Yeah.
category one is cost savings. We already know that log processing, that data movement, data storage is extremely costly. It's one of the
Yeah.
fastest growing
Definitely.
cost centers for folks. And people are like, well, okay, I don't have that much data. Like, how big a deal is it? Well, like, imagine it's not even that much data, but you have compute nodes that have to process the data, even if it's small. So you kind of have to add that into your overall cost, and so on and so forth. There's the security and all that kind of stuff. So there is a big thing on cost. And because we help you process the data before you move it, that enables you to move a lot less data and save a bunch of costs, especially when it's insecure, raw, unaggregated data. We can show you how to save whatever, 90%. That's not an exaggeration, 90%
Yeah.
over what you're doing today. So there's a cost savings that we can do.
Mm.
Second is just faster answers. Okay. And so this is, think like, again, not even a terribly complicated thing. You have, I don't know, 50 retail shops, right? And each
Yep.
retail shop has cameras in it, or maybe point of sale systems, or inventory systems, so on and so forth. Today, many of those things are having to send all their data into a centralized location before they can do something. And so that's not just the time of moving this data into a central location, processing it once it's there, aggregating it across all these stores, and so on and so forth. Like, that can take minutes, hours, days, weeks is not all uncommon. We're working with a very large fossil fuel company who's takes months to process wellhead data. So there's lots of different things like that. If you can do some initial pass of processing before you move it, now that means you can trigger events and things in the thing is, the speed of answers. So one of the challenges you have is, like, when you think about moving this data, and again, it could be video, it could be retail transaction data, it could be anything in these distributed places. And it doesn't have to be a lot of places. Like, let's say it's, I don't know, 50, retail shops, or 50 warehouses, or whatever, three different regions that you're in. When
Yeah.
you think about having to move all those things into a central location, it's move the data, it's process it, it's get it into your ETL pipeline, so on and so forth. And that right there can just be time, minutes, hours, days, weeks. We're working with a top five fossil fuel company that
Yep.
is taking months to do this processing of data, and that just means you're getting answers very slowly. So, to flip it on its head, if you could do some of that initial processing before you move it, that means you can now trigger events. You can take remediation and other actions, like at the point of that location. All that kind of good stuff can happen as well. And that's something, again, that we have built in.
Excellent.
And then the third big benefit is just security and regulations. So a
Yeah.
lot of times, even if you have very, very small data, simply moving the data across boundaries, country boundaries, continent boundaries, whatever it might be, might trigger regulation and other things like that. And the amount of things that are exposed to that, people are like, oh, well, I'm not in HIPAA or I'm not in financial services. Guess what? Theoretically, if you go and read GDPR, for example, if you move someone's email address across boundaries, you're likely to be at risk. So what it means is like you have to build a distributed infrastructure which enables you to do processing over the data in those various locations. And again, that's something that we provide and have built in, by default. So, what I go all the way back to the initial part of this conversation, it's largely where you are as a customer, as an IT organization, as whatever. Which
Yes.
one of those is driving you mad? Which one of those is, geez, I don't want to wake up for work on Monday because
Pain
I
point.
have that problem to solve for, and we can help with that.
Excellent. Tell me, and then just lastly from my side, in your opinion, what type of mindset would you say is needed to be successful as a founder of a company?
You know, probably the biggest thing is moderation of your emotions. I just don't have no way else to say that, and not to leap to that kind of like element. It is so hard when you are doing this, not to get too optimistic, not to get too sad, like just about everything. It's just hard. Um, and all of that is you have to like stay with it. You have to be absolutely fanatical about your belief in the thing that you are working on at a high level, that this is a problem that people need to solve for it, so on and so forth. But don't get too fanatical because you will miss pivots. You will miss like what customers are actually telling you. You'll try and convince yourself, hey, you know what? This customer is stupid. I'm going to move on.
Yeah.
Um, and sometimes customers are stupid, but but that doesn't mean you should ignore what you hear. If you hear 10 stupid customers in a row, guess what? You're probably stupid, right? Or you're in the wrong
Good
area,
point.
right? So,
Yeah.
I'm a pretty excitable guy. I'm very optimistic about the opportunity that technology has to fix the world and do all these amazing things. However, you just got to be so thoughtful about moderating your emotions, making sure you don't get like too happy when, a customer says, I guarantee I'm going to do this deal.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
or too sad when they're like, you have a terrible product, get the hell out of here, and I never want to see you again. Like it's moderating those things that is one of the biggest thing. The other thing is a real, a real belief in the North Star and the ability to sell that North Star to a lot of different people. That's again just really hard to like internalize, really hard to I don't know, like i-
Yeah.
if you don't believe in it, the moment you start the company that you are going to be a $1 billion company and change the world and so on and so forth, um, it will only get worse from there. So like you've got to do that, you got to hold on to that, and you've got to like be able to infect other people with that because like otherwise, it's gonna be really hard.
It's going to be, yo, this was such an informative discussion, David.
Oh,
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much, man. Hey, and thanks for coming on. It was fun. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Tell me, just lastly from my side, David, where can people reach out to you?
I'm on Bluesky. I'm on Twitter. You can certainly, I don't care. You can email me directly. It's my last name at expanso.io.
Okay.
Please, we are an open source project. Come by, give us feedback and so on. The code is open source, but the binaries are commercial. And yeah, outside of that, we're ready to go.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Appreciate it.
Okay, my pleasure.
Thank you.